let's start with something that you all know about. What is the normal view about education? This is the view that you were very likely taught by your parents, teachers, principal. It's the one that politicians will say in a debate. And it's this: we should have more and better education. It would be a very rare politician to get in front of a public podium and say we need less and worse education. It's hard even to imagine someone that would say something like that. Right? And furthermore, this is a case where there's actually a big meeting of the minds between economists and the public. In my first book, I talk about all the ways where economists and the public disagree. Education is actually an area where economists usually share the normal view for once, of thinking that we need to have a greater investment in education. Now, a lot of this comes from economists measuring the return to education. This basically means that you look at education as if it were an investment of any other kind, an investment in a shoe factory or in bonds, and try to see what the actual payoff is, all things considered. Right? And it's common when economists come up with a nice high number for this return to education to conclude that this shows that education builds human capital. In other words, that it has poured skill into you. You go into school as an unskilled child and you emerge as a skilled adult. Which brings me to the big puzzle. This is a puzzle that has been on my mind since I was about 5 years old. And I looked around the classroom and something seemed wrong, and it's never stopped seeming wrong to me. This is when you actually experience education. It's hard not to notice that most classes do not teach job skills. Most classes don't seem even remotely related to any job that students are ever likely to hold. The only job that you seem to be prepared for in most classes is to be a teacher of that very subject. So you take your history class. Right now I'm learning how to be a history teacher. But again, that would not be much of a justification for teaching it because you're just training people to do the very same thing that's currently being done. All right, so you can step back and just say, what fraction of U.S. jobs ever use knowledge of history? Right? For what jobs would you be afraid to hire a person who had forgotten their high school history lessons? Seems very few. Higher mathematics. Most jobs do not actually use higher mathematics. Even most people have gone on to calculus when asked, say they aren't even using algebra or geometry on the job. Right? So it seems again that most of the math that people learn, they don't actually use. Even engineers say they very rarely use calculus or algebra on the job, which I'm a little confused by that, but that's what they tell me, so I have to take their word for it. Music and art. These are required subjects in most American schools. My sons, when they were in grades 4 through 6, they were in a school where they had 3 different required music classes. They had chorus, required, dance, required, and music appreciation, required. My kids hated the dance class so much that I called up the vice principal and asked, is there any way to get them out of this? No, they must dance. There is no choice but to dance. All right, and then Shakespeare. You can learn English as spoken 500 years ago. A little unclear when you would use that in real life. Foreign languages. Again, this is a case where it's very important to distinguish the United States from most other countries. In many other countries, you learn English in school and it opens many doors. In the United States, however, the languages that you learn open almost no career doors. Right? And actually, I did track down data on what fraction of Americans even claim to have learned to speak a foreign language very well in school. Under 1% say this. This is self-reported, so of course people tend to overrate themselves. Lots of Americans speak foreign languages, but they don't learn it in school. They learn it in the home. Right? And then, of course, you've got the teaching of Latin, which actually almost died out and has been revived. So a dead language. Again, when would you use this? You might end up in a time machine and you're in ancient Rome and you can speak Latin. But other than that, when would you use this on a job? There is a classic question that the bad student in the back of the room asks in so many classes, which is, what does this have to do with real life? What does trigonometry have to do with real life? Well, now you know, right? What does trigonometry have to do with real life? Have you seen it? Seen the many uses of the cotangent? How often it comes up? All right. Now, what's strange about this is not just that the material that is being taught is not going to be useful in real life or on the job. Like you might just say, well, of course it's not useful because it's being taught by ivory tower professors who know next to nothing about the real world. And this describes me. I have not been out of school since I was 5 years old. I've not taken any kind of break. I have very little firsthand experience with anything outside of academia. Right? So I talk to people outside of academia. I read about it, but I don't really see it. So anyway, it makes sense that if you put the power to choose the topics In the hands of a person who knows very little about the real world, they will choose a bunch of topics that are not very relevant. But here's the weird thing, and this is the thing that bothered me from an early age. Employers still pay a large premium to people who study these subjects. Employers are very concerned if you haven't studied these subjects. In fact, one Aristotle class that is missing from your transcript that prevents you from graduating may lead you to not being able to get a high-paid job. And this is weird. It's not weird that the material is not relevant. It's weird that people who are practical, employers who want to get good workers, care about your performance on such impractical tasks. All right, and now I come to the signaling explanation. This is not in any way original to me. So Michael Spence, an economist, has a Nobel Prize for this. So what's original, I will claim, is I really believe it. So Michael Spence has a lot of theory papers. It's not clear to me if even he takes his own idea that seriously, but out of empirical researchers in economics, what I'm telling you is not considered more than a curiosity by most people. So maybe 10, 20%, not very important though. Anyway, it's easy to explain all these facts using this signaling model of education. The main idea says, sure, some school raises productivity, and that's not puzzling. It's not puzzling that reading, writing, and math raise your productivity, or rather raise your pay, because they raise your productivity. You use reading and writing and math on most jobs. So there's nothing odd about that. Schools teach it, employers need it, they pay you more for it. Nothing requires a great explanation. But a lot of education in the signaling model is what we call hoop jumping. You are doing something impressive to get attention, to impress others. Why? Because you want to show off or signal desirable traits. Especially you want to show off your intelligence. You want to show employers that you are smart. You want to show off your work ethic. You want to show that I'm a hardworking person. And then finally, you want to show your conformity. You're not just a smart, hardworking person. You are a smart, hardworking person who understands and respects social rules. You're not someone who's going to show up at an office and say, look, I'm taking over here. From now on, I'm the boss. Instead, you want to be someone who says, look, what are the rules here? What is expected of me? Or better yet, you don't even need to be told. You just show up and you intuit what the rules are and you follow them without people having to explain them to you. All right, key assumptions of signaling models. First of all, you need to have some hard to observe differences. So if you could instantly look at a human being and know how good they were as a worker, there'd be no need for signaling. So it needs to be the case that it isn't obvious how good of a worker somebody is at first glance. Secondly, you need the differences to correlate with something observable like diplomas or grades. So the underlying differences that are what people really care about need to correlate, that are hard to see, need to correlate with something that you can easily see. All right, and then last, you need higher productivity workers to have lower costs of performing this observable activity. That could be lower a lot of different ways that a cost could be lower. It could be money. Right? So right now, it is cheaper for a good student to get a degree than a not so good student. How so? Well, at minimum, a good student is likely to finish on time, and therefore you pay 4 years tuition. If you are a mediocre student, more likely to take 6 years, and so you pay 50% more tuition. All right, so that's a way in which better students actually have a lower financial cost. There's also time, right? Again, the good student only takes 4 years out of the labor force to get their degree. Weaker student takes 6. But then there's also just pain. There's just the unpleasantness of the experience. So a general psychological rule is people like doing things they're good at. So it's enjoyable to be a student if you're getting A's and praise all the time. On the other hand, what is it like to be a C student? Probably few of the people in this room know firsthand, but if you open your eyes, they're in the room with you. Just imagine, what would it feel like to be getting C's on your work for year after year? Like disappointment from teachers, from parents. Right? What would that be like? It's just a discouraging thing to do or to experience. Now, in signaling models, the market rewards people who show their stuff even if the display itself is wasteful. Employers might go and pay you a lot of extra money because you finished your Aristotle class, which meant that you graduated, and thereby show that you respect the social norm that graduation is expected of people in our society. All right. Now, the ubiquity of useless education. So I think the strongest reason to believe in the power of signaling is just to look at the curricula. Just look at curricula, look at what people study, compare this to what you do in the real life, and just marvel at the contrast. Right? So just some quick facts. So in the U.S., only about 30% of high school courses are spent on English and math. right? So when people say, well, you're going to school to go and learn literacy and numeracy, yeah, like 30% of the time. What about the other 70% of the time? What's going on there? Right? And over 40% of time is spent on arts, foreign language, history, and social studies. Now, I am an economist, but in terms of what actual jobs you're being prepared for, especially doing K through 12 social studies, pretty mysterious. We see similar patterns for U.S. college majors. So under 25% of graduates are in a major that you could say is vocational without laughing. So, all right. So, there are some borderline cases like agricultural science. Yeah, all right. Let's just say let's say that's vocational. Economists are very quick to bring up engineers whenever I talk. Engineers are about 5% of all college graduates. So they could be completely right about engineers and still they're forgetting about 95% of what's happening. All right. Now, my dad actually is an electrical engineer and he agrees with me quite strongly. This is the only area where actually we do agree. But my dad will say, yeah, he has a PhD. I spent all those years proving theorems. I never had to prove a theorem on the job. Right? My dad actually says the only reason he finished his PhD was because they dropped the foreign language requirement his year. If they had not dropped the foreign language requirement at that very year, my dad would have finished at the master's, and who knows what would have happened. But he already had 2 kids. I'm not going to learn Russian just to go and get to be a high-ranked engineer, which again he would never use that. All right. Now this is really measures at the inputs, but we can also look at measured learning, looking at what people actually know. Now this is a tough question to handle because there's a problem that you can go and measure what people you can measure what people know at the end of a year into graduation. But this really ignores, not only a possibility, but a reality, which is that people forget most of what they learn, right? And that's why in the book I focus very heavily upon adult knowledge. And again, this is what employers are paying you for. Employers there's no reason for them to pay you for what you knew 20 years ago. They want to pay you for what you know now. That would seem to be the sensible thing to do. All right, now, of course, it's possible that adults learn what they know outside of school, but still I'll say this. Everything that you know is the maximum that you learned in school. It's a very simple point. And an upper bound on what schools have taught is 100% of what you know. So if we look at what people know and see they know very little, then schools could not have taught more than very little. All right. So researchers who measure adult literacy and numeracy find shockingly low levels. So, about a third of adult Americans would be at least borderline illiterate and illiterate. Right, not able to do very practical tasks like fill out a fill out a bank deposit slip, things like that, right? With no points off for misspelling. All right, so you still get full credit. All right. So anyway, literacy, numeracy, but at least most Americans are competent at these things. So okay, all right. So that is it's certainly worthwhile, but it's so a general rule is that whatever you mentally picture the literacy and numeracy level of someone is at, basically go down a full educational rank. So, the level of literacy and numeracy that you think of the typical college graduate having, they basically have about the level you would think of as the typical high school graduate having. High school graduates are about as good as you would think college dropout or high school dropouts are, and high school dropouts know very little. Now, when you go and look at knowledge of all the other subjects, the other 70% of the time, that's where it really is very close to nothing. Adult knowledge of civics, history, science, and foreign languages is really a rounding error. Right? A way I like to put it is that if you give adult Americans the easiest imaginable test of knowledge of American history or civics, basically where every question is one where you can't imagine someone not knowing it, they can get about half of them right. So, how many senators does each state have? About half of Americans get that right. If you're here, you're like, how can you not know that? Aren't you tested on that 10 times? All I can tell you is that's the fact. About half Americans get that question wrong. All right. Now, you might say, well, it's not that bad. I would say, look, not knowing half of the most very elementary facts is like not knowing half the letters in the alphabet. Again, what do you call someone who only knows half the letters in the alphabet? Illiterate. You cannot read if you only know half the letters of the alphabet. If you don't know that every state has 2 senators, what can you really say about U.S. politics? You're just completely confused. All right. And as I said, foreign language, under 1% of Americans even claim to have learned to speak a foreign language very well in school, even though you're doing 2 or 3 years. I don't know how many years you have to do for Trinity. Is it 3 years? 4? Do you need an AP? All right, so it's not that bad. But, this is a lot of time. It's not like they spend 5 weeks on it and don't know it. They spend years and don't know it. Now, what's kind of interesting about, so when I talk about this, most economists that I know have very little respect for psychologists, and shame on them. Right? In graduate school, even the word psychology was rarely pronounced without scare italics or sneer italics, like psychology. All right. That is not the way that I see the world. I believe in reading what anyone who studies a subject that's relevant has to say about it. But anyway, what's interesting is when you point out all these facts to economists, normally they suddenly discover that they do respect psychology after all. And they start talking about, well, I mean, fine, you don't use art, music, Shakespeare, history, like any of these subjects in the job, but you learn how to learn. So move along, nothing to see here. Well, there is actually a sub-branch of psychology called educational psychology that studies this learning how to learn. They've been working on the problem for about 100 years. And their main conclusion, I don't have time to go over it, but I have the references in the book, is that this mostly wishful thinking. And in general, if a teacher does a good job, then your students learn the stuff that you teach them. And that's it. This learning how to learn stuff, like they really want to find it, but they generally just find very little evidence of it. Now, the handsome rewards of useless education. This ubiquity of useless education would not be puzzling if education didn't pay well in the labor market. Then we just say, yeah, you waste a bunch of years learning a bunch of junk, and then employers don't care. Big surprise. But, at least in the U.S., the market rewards education very well. Right? So this is, here I'm telling you the same thing almost any labor economist will tell you, or almost any education economist. I assume Miguel is going to tell you the same thing, that people with more education make a lot more money, and this remains true after making all the statistical adjustments that you might think you should make. All right, so it's true that the true effect of education is probably smaller than it looks. There's even quite a few prominent labor and education economists who dispute this and just say what you see is what you get. My undergraduate teacher, David Card, is known for this, and he plays a big role in the book as a foil. But anyway, even if you make all the adjustments, there still seem to be very solid financial payoffs for education. What's nice about signaling, then, is that it's an elegant way to reconcile research on learning with research on earning. They can both be true. The signaling model explains it, as other stories cannot. Now, you might be signaling if. By the way, how much time do I have? Sorry.
11 minutes.
All right, great. Perfect. All right. You might be signaling if. These are all a bunch of symptoms of signaling that I believe you will find in your own life history. You might be signaling if you bother to enroll or pay tuition. How so? Well, suppose you consider Trinity to be the best university in the world. Have you ever had a professor check your ID card to make sure you're supposed to be in a class? Does that happen often? If someone comes up and to a professor and says, "I'm not really officially a student here. Do you mind if I take a class with you?" Normal professor's reaction is a small tear goes down their cheeks. Right? Someone wants to learn what I have to teach. This has never happened before. It's a great day. My life is meaningful. All right. So, if you thought that Trinity was the best university in the world, just move to the area and start attending classes. You don't have to enroll. You don't have to pay any tuition. You can do it year after year. There's just one little thing you will not have at the end of 4 years, and that is a diploma or any official recognition that you were a student here. Right? Now, how come almost no one tries this? Say on the standard view that you are having skill poured into you, this makes no sense. On the other end of the signaling model, it makes perfect sense. It means that the main thing students are looking for is precisely that diploma, and the learning is at least secondary, right? And so think about this. Suppose you could either have a Trinity education without the diploma or a Trinity diploma without the education. Which one would you want? Now, say if you even have to spend time thinking about it, you agree with me, right? The mere fact that it is non-obvious shows that you admit that signaling is important. Contrast this with being stuck on a desert island, and I say, which would be better? A boat building degree without knowledge of boat building, or knowledge of boat building without a boat building degree? On an island, you know which one you want. Who cares about a diploma? I want to know how to build boats so I can get off the island. But in the modern education system and labor market, you have to think about it, and that shows signaling matters a lot. Another sign you might be signaling. If you worry about failing the final exam, but not about forgetting the material that you learned when the exam is over. How so? Well, if employers are paying you for skill, then if you forget, that should be just as bad as never having known. On the other hand, if they are paying you for the signal, well, if you go and do well in a class and you get it, or do well in your class and get a bunch of A's, employers can look at that and say, look, there's the person who can do well when he applies himself. And you know what? That's good, because I'm going to ask him to apply himself on a totally different subject that I'm going to pay him for. So that's fine. Right? I mean, all that it really shows that you've forgotten the courses that you got A's in is that you're human, because no human being has photographic memory. I checked. There's a footnote on that. There's no such thing as photographic memory in the real world. All right. So another puzzle signaling can resolve. But if you don't think that cheating is only cheating yourself, if you're going to school to get skill, then cheating is basically paying a lot of money to not learn skills. It's stupid. On the other hand, if you're signaling, then it makes sense, because cheating is a way to trick employers into thinking that you're good when you're not. You're impersonating a good student. And also you are devaluing the degree of all the other students who actually did the work. You might be signaling if you seek out easy A's. So I'm sure no one in this room has ever done. Right? Yes. So if you deliberately try to find teachers where they give you an A in exchange for very little work, and if you're there to get skills, this doesn't make very much sense. But if you are there to impress employers, this makes perfect sense. Right? Or similarly, if you rejoice when teachers cancel class. Hey, I'm going to take your money and I'm not going to teach you anything. Are you happy? Yes, I'm very happy. Right? This is odd if you are here to get skill, but it makes a lot of sense if you are just there to get the signal, because employers don't know the class was canceled. They never will. They'll never find out. And therefore, you can, again, use this to impersonate the good student, which means that employers are happy to employ you. Right? Now, what is wrong with signaling? Who cares if education builds human capital or merely signals it? What difference does it make? The answer is that signaling models imply that education has what economists call negative externalities, which is which is basically negative side effects, bad side effects that you impose upon other people through your individual action. Best analogy of this is, suppose that if there's a bunch of people at a concert, everyone's sitting down, and then one person would like to see better. What can you as an individual do to see better at the concert? Stand up. All right. Therefore, it follows that if everyone stands up, everyone sees better, right? Wrong. If everyone stands up, everyone gets sore feet, and nobody sees better. Right? And in signaling models, that is what education is like. If everybody gets more, then you need more in order to impress employers. Right? Okay? And again, so in the book, I talk a lot about credential inflation, about how over the last 70 years, when people at the Bureau of Labor Statistics and places like that look at the amount of education that people need to get a given job, it's gone up by about a full degree. So like in 1950, the idea of a waiter with a college degree would have seemed insane. Now, actually, it's very common, especially for nice restaurants. In terms of the skill you need to do that job, it's hard to see that it's increased. In fact, it seems like it's decreased. 1950, your waiter probably did arithmetic at the table, figured out your bill right in front of you. Now, it doesn't happen anymore. But what has happened is that there's been a big increase in the education level of the workforce, which means you now need more to convince employers that you are worthy of being a waiter. All right, now, last, policy implications. Again, what I find is, in general, everyone is with me until now. Not all right. Well, not everyone, but a lot of people are with me till now, especially people who just say, yeah, that sounds like an exact description of everything I suffered through. And then I say, all right, well, if you call it suffering, how about we just have less education? And this is where people say, no, suffering is terrible, is useless, but it's also really important and great. I'm a little puzzled. But anyway, so one big implication to come out of signaling models is to cut education spending. And since I think it's a lot, I think it would be a good idea to cut education spending a lot. You think about this as educational austerity, right? It's trying to reduce the availability of funding for education so that people get less. There is a whole literature where people estimate how much more education would we get if the costs were lower. Normally, people doing this research want the cost to be lower. All I did in the book is I took their research and then multiplied by -1. All right, and I just say, all right, well, I mean, there seems like you've done high quality work and you've shown that if we make education this much cheaper, this many fewer people will go. How about we make it more expensive so that fewer people will go? Right? And again, so if you thought of education as building skills, this would mean that we'd be de-skilling the workforce. I think the main thing going on is that you were jumping through hoops to impress. The main thing that happens is just lowers employers' expectations for how many years of your life do you have to spend jumping through hoops to be worthy of the actual job training? All right. Now, many people say, no. Like, we should not be cutting. We should be reforming. We should be fixing the curriculum. Fine. Like, let's go and change it so that it does actually build human capital. And this is the main argument that I had with Eric Hanushek, who's a great education economist. And here, my background in political economy comes out, and I say, look, I don't trust the education system. I don't trust them if we say, hey, here's all the money we've been giving you. Now spend it better from now on. Right? This seems like, given that they've been wasting so much money for so long, well, why would you think that they will do that? Right? Seems much more realistic to just say, look, there's way too much going on. There's going to be less. And if you reform yourselves and really start building a lot of human capital, then after that, we'll come back and take a look. And if we decide that you're right, then great. But otherwise, you're just going to have to make do with less. I think about this, like if you had a gardener, you find out he hasn't done any gardening for years. And then you go up and say, hey, you haven't been doing it. He says, right, first of all, all right, fine, sorry. Second of all, keep paying me full salary. And from now on, I am going to garden. Like, it sounds like a really bad deal for me. How about you go and basically get your act together, go and get the whole garden cleaned up, and then come back and maybe we can then talk about it. But until then, you've been wasting my money and I don't trust you. All right, so cutting is easy. Meaningful reform is very hard. And there's this odd double standard when someone says we need more money for education. Yay. They don't know. Whereas when I say less, people say, give me an exact detailed blueprint for every single possible cut. It's like, when people wanted to raise it, you don't need this blueprint. Why do I need to have the blueprint when I say cut? Or again, when people want to cut spending that people are not favorable to begin with, again, that's the general idea. Let's cut military spending. The Cold War's over. There was not the same kind of, we can't even imagine cutting a dime of the Pentagon's budget until you map out a full new strategy for American military in the post-Cold War era. And that could take decades, so get on that. Now, the minor policy implication, right, is to make education much more vocational. Now, I see this is moderately better for the student. So there is research on the benefits of vocational education for the student, suggesting that even the typical college-bound student would benefit if they would just do more vocational education, just a bit, just to get their feet wet in the labor market. And especially for students who just do not like school and are likely to drop out or even end up in prison. Big benefit of vocational education for someone like that. And again, there's a lot of kids like that. And you could say if only they had a great teacher, that would make them love school. That seems like a real stretch. There's just a lot of people who don't like it. But in any case, I say it's vastly better for taxpayers if you train people for actual practical skills rather than having them jump through hoops. So I think that from the social point of view, vocational education is especially good. And of course, this does not mean that you take a 12-year-old and say, boom, you're a plumber. That's your life. Right? Instead, you could go and say, hey, we're going to spend a year exploring 20 different plausible occupations, 2 weeks each, and see whether there's anything that you like and are good at. So there's no reason for vocational education to be something that limits someone at a young age. It can be something that exposes them to a wide variety of options. This is a common defense of the system that we have. There's just one big difference. The current system exposes people to a wide variety of pipe dreams. Oh, maybe you'll be a poet or a novelist or an artist or a composer, or maybe you'll be a mathematician or an historian. These are all things where if a parent heard their kid wanted to pursue this career, they would say, no, they're dead ends. Hardly anyone succeeds at those. Far better to go and expose people to a bunch of jobs that where each one of them has a reasonable chance of working out. And I will now pass it over.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. It was also a real pleasure to read Bryan's book. But of course, John has not invited me to praise the book. He has invited me to offer some criticism. So let me try to earn my dinner here. Let me first summarize in 4 lines what it is that I think the book is doing. The book argues that education is about 80% information transmission. That is, you trying to communicate to employers something about yourself, like that you're a disciplined person and so forth. And the book thinks of this as a very specific thing, which is signaling as in Spence, as Bryan said. And I fully agree with him. He is the person who perhaps has most seriously taken that model and said, let's take that model to its logical conclusion. And then the second part of the book, as he finished saying, is that therefore the conclusion is that education is socially wasteful. We're basically wasting time and wasting money, and we should shrink the educational sector. So let me start my comments by saying that one could certainly debate the 80% number. And indeed, I suspect that most labor economists, as he's mentioned, David Card and other people, Eric Hanishek, would focus their comments on that. They would say, no, you're actually wrong. If it's not 80% and it's 50%, then one starts to doubt some of the implications. What I'm going to do actually is I'm going to set that issue aside. And I'm going to set it aside for a couple of reasons. One is I think information transmission is very interesting. It's worth focusing on. In this way, I'm going to basically give the book the best opportunity, saying, okay, let's say it's 80% information transmission, and let's see what we think. And I will make the case that basically policymakers and students should still question the book's main conclusions, even if we say what is going on is 80% education transmission. So let me make that those points, and let me start by saying why we should take information transmission seriously, and let me just give me one slide to talk about models. I will only talk about models one slide, and then I will explain what I'm saying in an extended anecdote and data that comes from the Supreme Court actually. So let me say two things about models. In the Spence model, it's important to see what is going on in the Spence model. People are of two types. Okay, so there's more and less able people. So let's say that in this classroom, there's there's space in the middle there that basically everyone from the middle down is less able. We're the less able people. We're lower down, and the people in the back, they're the high ability people. So Spence said, think of a world where there's only two types of people. Now, what's key in these models is that some things are observable and some are not. So it's not observable when we walk out of here to try to get jobs. The employer cannot see which of us was sitting where and does not know who's high or low ability. And the employer would like to figure that out. What the employer can see is if we went to school or not. There is one more ingredient, as Bryan mentioned, that school is less costly for the more able. So going to school, as we all know, is costly. One has to sit through boring lectures silently. This is not an easy thing to do. And the key assumption in Spence is that people who are high ability, those people in the back of the room, in the back half, find it less costly to do this. They just do it, whereas those of us in the front don't like it. And so what Spence basically said is, you can think, his main insight was to say you can think of an equilibrium where basically only half of the people in this room go to school. That is, those people in the back go to school because they're more able. Those of us in the front don't. Those in the back get stamped with an S for school on their forehead, which is easily observable. And then when we walk out and try to get a job, then things go well because employers can look at us, know who is who, and they give the people in the back jobs and pay them more. And the only extra ingredient that I fully agree with Bryan Spence, kind of said in passing, is he said this could hold even if schooling were useless, right? Even if you were learning nothing useful, that's not the point. The point is transmitting information. Okay. Let me speak of just one more model, one that I've worked on with basically Bentley McLeod, that is slightly different, but you'll see that once you start complicating this, then you say, well, maybe education does something after all. And think now of a model where there are many ability types. So now it's not just that the people in the back of the room are smarter than those in the front, but let's say that people in each row are different. Okay, so that the least able people are those in the front row. I apologize. And then the ones in the second row are a little bit more able, and the third row, and so on and so forth. And the most able people are the ones in the back row. Okay, so there's lots of differences. And say that now schooling is equally costly for all of us. Okay, so we all go to school, let's say. But what ends up happening is that there are many schools, and these become selective on ability. So lots of schools come in, and they cater to rows. So for example, the easiest school, the least fancy school, would cater to those of us in the front, and so on and so forth. And there would be a fancy, very selective school that caters only to the people in the back row that says, I'm going to check if you're able, right? If you're very able. How will I know? I might give you an SAT test. I might look at your grades. I might give you interviews, and only then will I accept you. Okay. And what happens here is that going to basically selective school can reveal one's ability, because those in the back row go to the fanciest school. They get an F here for fancy school. And when we walk out of the room, employers can say, oh, there's someone who went to a fancy school. That is a person who I want to hire. Okay. As you see in this model, the key question is not whether you go to school, but which school you go to. Okay. What is going on in this model? Actually, something that's going on in both models, but is more going on in the bottom one, is that the school system sorts people, particularly as we enter levels, right, whether primary schooling or high school or college, and then eventually matches us to jobs. Okay. Now, if you're not an economist, you might think, this is really boring. Why would I care about models that are subtly different? Let me tell you why you should care. And I'm going to use an anecdote and data that originates from clerks at the Supreme Court. And I'm going to use a quote to start from Judge Antonin Scalia. He visited several years ago, when he was still alive, law school, and was asked by a student, how do you choose clerks to be your, how do you choose law school graduates to be your clerk? And this is a very prestigious job, obviously, one of the best things you can do after law school if you do really well. And he said, so this is verbatim from the judge, he said, by and large, I'm going to be picking from the law schools that basically are the hardest to get into. Okay? And then he said, they admit the best and the brightest, and they may not teach very well. So notice that here Scalia is agreeing with Bryan. He says, the fanciest school, that which caters to the people in the back of the room, I don't know if it teaches very well or if it teaches better than the one that caters to those of us at the front. It may be that it teaches any, useless stuff. But his point was, these schools get the brightest people, right? And as all of us know, it is possible, if you're a bad teacher, to teach your students nothing. It is impossible to make a student less able, right? This seems impossible. He said it more eloquently, as usual. He said, but you can't make a sow's ear out of a silk purse. That is, you can't ruin a smart student. And he said, if they come in the best and the brightest, they're probably going to leave the best and the brightest, okay? And so he said, I basically hire people from only the fanciest law schools. Now, it turns out that basically all of his colleagues agree with him, because from Sotomayor to Thomas, basically all of the justices hire clerks from the fanciest schools. So I went and looked up the last 20 clerks hired at the Supreme Court, and they come from only 7 schools. So 6 individuals come from Harvard, 6 from Yale, 4 from Stanford, and then 1 each for the other schools. And there's hundreds of law schools, but basically they're high. All of them, any judge that you look at, Kagan, any of them is basically hiring from these top schools. Why am I telling you this story? Let's use this story to think of those 2 models, okay? So let me make a contrast between those 2 models using this story. Judge Scalia's view, which is consistent with a model by myself and Bentley McLeod, which I put up, is he said, I'm repeating his words once again, I'm going to be picking from the law schools that basically are the hardest to get into. Now let's say that we take Bryan and make him a judge. His view, which would be consistent with the Spence model, is I'm going to be picking from those who went to law school. Because in his model, basically he says, there's 2 groups of people, those in the back who are the able, and then those in the front. And he says, all that matters is whether you go to school or not, and you get an S. So he would say, as a judge, I just need to see who graduated from law school. Check that's not what Judge Scalia said. He said, I need to see the school that the person went to. Clearly, the actual judges think that school identity is relevant, which school you went to. And you can start to see, I'm going to make a further contrast, that the Spencean model, that Spencean signaling, is not giving us a full account of this labor market, at least of this clerk labor market. Let me explain this in a different way, another version of the contrast. In Judge Scalia's world, there will be selective law schools. There will be lots of law schools, and some will be selective, right? And what's going to be true in his world is that some schools, maybe not all, but some schools are going to put a lot of energy into choosing who gets to get in, right? And students, on like their part, are going to put a lot of energy into trying to get into the best school. These schools are basically going to produce specific products like a Yale lawyer, whatever that means. Okay, the admissions process is going to be high stakes in that model. Okay. In Judge Caplan's world, in Spence, all schools would be open enrollment because the point, as he says, is who can graduate, who can finish, who can take that last Aristotle course. Okay, all schools will be open enrollment. The question is who can graduate. It's not who gets into which school. One thing that I like in the book is that Bryan admonishes, please test all claims against your own abundant experience. So I ask you, which is a more realistic description of the world? I have one child, she's a 16-year-old kid, and she's getting ready to apply to college. I did not ask her directly because I didn't need to. She would say the top one is the more accurate description of the world because it turns out colleges are selective, and it turns out they have to work really hard to get into a specific college, and those colleges put a lot of energy into trying to decide who gets in. This view has actually probably become more realistic over the years. Spence probably wrote his paper, given that there are publication lags in the 1960s. In the 1960s, the schools at the top were less selective than they are now. And if anything, law schools, colleges have become, those at the top, not all of them, have become more and more selective. This is in contrast to parts of the college sector. Okay, so now I've given you these models. Let's see, so fine, one may fit reality more. Why would we care from a policy point of view? why care about the contrast between these models? Suppose, let me do a final slide on the Supreme Court to illustrate this. Suppose that clerks are important inputs. Okay, so let's say that you talk to a judge of the Supreme Court and the judge says, actually, having a good clerk is really important for me because the clerks, we are told, sometimes do a lot of the work. They're certainly doing a lot of the research, and they tell you, I know that clerks are important. And let's say that they actually know that the judges know something about hiring clerks. After all, if you accumulate the experience, if you add it up of all of the judges, they have been doing this for about 350 years. Okay, and they hire often. They're hiring clerks all the time. In short, let's say that the judges are right to value a very good person from the Yale Law School. Now, suppose that after reading this book, right, you say, let's ban law school because it's a waste of time. This is basically Bryan's point. Or let's cut subsidies a lot. As he has said elsewhere, imagine a world where you could get a good job right out of high school. Let's just end law school because there's lots of stuff being taught there that is not useful. And in Bryan's defense, there's lots of people in the law industry that say that lots of stuff taught in law schools is not that useful. But if we did this, the production process of the Supreme Court of one firm, let's call it, out there in the economy would suffer. Basically, Judge Scalia would be upset at that point, if you're alive, or Judge Kagan would be upset because she would say, "Look, I needed that worker. This is a very good worker. He or she is integral to my production process, and now I no longer know who's who because this level of education, which is law school, has ended." So basically, I would say policymakers may wish to ignore the book's prescription, even if what schools are basically doing is information transmission, because schools can serve a useful function by transmitting information. If we erased law school, or it would be harder for the Supreme Court judges to find the human capital input that they need. Okay, so this is on the side of basically information transmission. Let me say something. I said that both policymakers and students should be skeptical about the book. Let me say something about students and move a little bit away from information transmission. I won't claim that schools are teaching anything useful. As I said, I'm going to give Bryan the benefit of the doubt on that. Why, as a student, would I feel that I have to take this with quite a bit of a grain of salt? Being less generous to the judges, it could be that their hiring reflects a club. So what Scalia basically said is, I hire people from Yale and Harvard because they're the best. Okay, and that is possibly true. Another interpretation is the judges hire people from Yale and Harvard because they went to Yale and Harvard, and it's just a big club, and they're hiring their friends' students, and so on and so forth. That's also consistent with the data. In other words, it may be that networks, clubs that you get into, rather than ability, are the key to the top jobs. This is possible. Now, how do you get networks? I suppose that none of the students in this classroom is forming a network as I speak. Networks are not formed in the classroom. You need to make friends to have networks. These are usually acquired at dining halls, in late night library study, at parties, and so forth. There is where you might make friends that then you bank on, and they might help you later in life, get you jobs, etc., etc. Access to networks may be more restricted than the book suggests. So as Bryan mentioned, he said anyone can just walk into Princeton or into Trinity and take classes for free, and that may well be true. If many people did it, maybe Princeton and Trinity would notice it. But I agree that maybe you can just walk in here. This classroom is a good example. Anyone can walk in here. As he says, fact, anyone can study at Princeton for free, and he says anyone can gorge oneself at Princeton's buffet of the mind. Now, what is true is if you want to acquire networks, though, it doesn't quite work like that. I would invite you to try to walk into Princeton's dining room to make friends without having paid tuition. I think that's going to be harder than walking into some random classroom. What one may need is actually to gorge oneself at Princeton's actual buffet. And that is harder than basically walking into a classroom. So from a student's perspective, I would also say school identity matters, even for reasons apart from information transmission, and basically I would also take therefore the book's implications with a little bit of a grain of salt. Let me make one final point if I have time.
Yes, you do.
Okay, and this is, I'm going to finally speak a little bit about the curriculum. The book's prescriptions strike me somewhat as heavy-handed in basically saying that most of the college curriculum in this case is useless. Bryan may be a little bit alone at present, right? But he's certainly not alone in history. There is a long tradition in the U.S., particularly in the 19th century, of basically saying that colleges teach nothing useful. For example, he criticizes people who believe education builds mental muscles. This was exactly the criticism leveled at colleges in the 19th century. In the 1800s, as I mentioned, Yale and most colleges, Yale was just the shining example because it sort of defended this way of doing things. States were criticized for exactly that. Now, one thing that happened as a result, not just because of that, but for other reasons, also, states tried to take control of colleges. For example, the state of basically, like New Hampshire, tried to take control of Dartmouth College, and this case went straight up to the Supreme Court, to get back to the Supreme Court. A young lawyer by the name of Daniel Webster basically held Dartmouth's case there, and Judge John Marshall ruled that Dartmouth's charter was a contract and guaranteed such colleges autonomy for the long term. Now, what this did is that this basically, I think, made the U.S. market competitive, and especially someone who believes in sort of libertarian ideas, I think that there's lots of problems with U.S. colleges, but there's also lots of good stuff about U.S. colleges and U.S. universities. For example, they're the world's leading producers of research, which probably creates all kinds of positive externalities, to get back to the externalities thing. And I think this is a strength of the American system. There's a historian, Rudolph, who basically said that this decision by Marshall allowed all of the incompetence, variety, and final achievement associated with competitive American enterprise. And in that respect, it allowed the colleges to suffer the results and to reap the benefits of their own decisions. So my own gut would be to say, let's let the market decide this. If some college wants to say we're going to stop teaching liberal arts and we're only going to teach plumbing or whatever, that's fine. That could go on. And then someone else can do something else. That is the nature of the American system, and then we could let the market sort of shake it out. Saying that the whole thing is kind of wrong, or that we should change the whole thing or cut subsidies to everyone, strikes me as a little bit heavy-handed. Let me conclude. This is a fun and refreshing book. As I said, I was tasked to make criticisms here. I really enjoyed this book. It has a nice emphasis on information transmission. I like the topic perhaps more than most labor economists. It demonstrates the book a nice willingness to think of and criticize what it is that schools and colleges do. It lands lots of punches on what Bryan calls education enthusiasm and online enthusiasm. And I personally share some of those views. So I think that I basically appreciated lots of stuff in this book. But things are more complex than the book suggests. Education has social value, even if it were 80% information transmission. For example, as I mentioned already, schools sort and match students via school identity. For those of you in the room who are economic students, I think that one lesson is economic models like Spence can be extremely useful. I'll be the last one to say that you shouldn't look at economic models or that Spence is not a fun model. It is one of my favorite models. But no single model in isolation provides a sufficient roadmap for policy. You can't say, I don't like saying, I'm going to just think of one model and then let that guide all the way. Every successful model makes abstractions, right? Says, okay, let's assume that there's only two types of people, for example, and then gets a bunch of things. That's good. There's insight that comes out of there. But more generally, we should think of different models and of different ways of thinking of something as we think of policy and what to do. Thanks for your time. Let me stop there.
And now we're at the segment of Q&A between the two panelists. I'll try and act as moderator. Bryan, you have received some criticisms. Let's start with you.
Yep. So a question about your model. So as far as I understand your model, if the government were to heavily subsidize education, it would have all the same bad effects I'm talking about. Isn't that true?
What do you mean by a bad effect?
So, encouraging much greater investment in education, even though the end result is that the 20 people from the top schools wind up working for the Supreme Courts. It's like in that model, what is the point of going and subsidizing education if they're just going to go and take the top 20 people, or the people from the top schools?
So, I don't think so. If you made a welfare analysis with that model, I don't think that So if what's going on is information transmission, lowering the so I'll tell you strictly what happens in the model. If you lower the cost of all schools, which is what I take by what you mean by a subsidy, there's just going to be more schools and they're going to be more selective. there's nothing a priori in the model that says that's a good or a bad thing.
So, I mean, again, isn't the case that if it's just that the people at the top schools get the good good rewards, and people lower schools get worse ones, and it just shifts up the whole distribution?
So the basic, so one thing that is going on in that model is that basically what we care of as economists, let's say, or as policymakers, is that the economy be basically be highly productive, or to make it more productive. And what that model, one of the things that model is saying is that one role of the college system is to basically match people to jobs, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, and that is, for example, what Judge Kagan wants, right? She says, show me the most able lawyers, let's say, and match them to my job. And so that is one thing that is just something that can raise productivity. And to the extent that the education sector exists, it's going to do that. If the education sector were to disappear, was my point, that feature will basically go down. Subsidies, could move things in either direction, but they don't do anything a priori bad in this model.
Well, except burn up a lot of extra resources. I mean, so it doesn't sound like your model shows that you get, that if you were to go and make education cheaper across the board, that you would get better sorting at all, but you definitely are spending more resources on the education.
You would probably get more sorting, basically. Yeah.
So should we switch off? Or?
Sure.
Yeah.
Miguel, have you a question or a comment?
This is the most difficult part of the program. Because, I don't think I have an immediate question other than the ones I raised or points I raised. I didn't prepare other ones. Yeah.
Well, I was going to offer a comment.
Sure.
Bryan said that employers don't know whether a class has been canceled when they evaluate the student and the degree. I would add that the professor's employer, from what I can tell, doesn't know if class has been canceled.
Doesn't care either.
Bryan.
Yeah, so I mean, I completely agree that we should not simplistically take a really simple model and treat it literally. I would say that in my book I actually have a model very much like yours, but actually more, because it's not just the selectivity of the college that sends a signal, it's also the major sends a signal, grade sends signals. So I mean, and in the book I explicitly admit that there is some social value in having the sorting. The key insight we get from Spence, though, is once we've got the sorting, then the marginal value of having everyone do one more degree is zero, right? And so I would say that I beg forgiveness. I did not cite. I'm pretty sure I did not cite your model, but I just took it for granted, actually, which I think almost everyone else does. That Spence's model is too simple because in this one it's purely redistributive, and it doesn't really matter if you put a janitor in to do a doctor's job. Right, so I mean, of course, that's there too, and like if you read through the book, numerous admissions to this, but still, the insight that Spence gives us is once we've got a ranking, there's no point in having everyone do one more degree, and there's no point in just going and adding on an extra year for the whole population. There's no point in subsidizing college so everyone can do it. So everyone does it, then what's going to happen is you just need even more than college in order to oppress employers at that point. So, I mean, yeah.
That's well taken. I mean, you basically say once there is a ranking, right? But one of the jobs of the education system is to produce a ranking. So one way in which I see Bryan's book is he basically says schools are not useful because they teach us anything useful. They're useful because they help us transmit information, or they basically create a ranking of people, like he said. But the word useful is in both clauses, right? And so then, if you say let's do away with schools, let's cut subsidies and close.
Let's have everyone get
close a bunch of schools.
minus 1 degree per person.
Then basically, so that minus 1 degree could be the final degree, right? That would be a logical place to start. For example, the final degree in the law industry is the law degree. This is why I made that example. And there, that rank, that sorting function would completely disappear. And as I said, the judges, I'm sure, would say you have done a disservice to the legal sector. And so, if one of the jobs of the education sector is to use Bryan's word, a rank, then that's what's going on. Now, what's true is that the Spence model creates a very blunt rank, right? It's school or not. And in fact, the point I made is that the other model creates a more thorough rank, and I think so. What is true in the U.S. economy is that the rank has become more and more thorough over the past 50 years. It used to be the case that there were very few schools that took students from the whole nation. For example, Yale was one of the very, very few schools. Harvard was not. Princeton was not. Princeton kind of was, but certainly Columbia was not. and more schools have become national, so that they're basically taking students from different places and creating a very finely grained rank. And so that rank is useful. That rank is part of what makes the economy more productive, arguably. That's what our model has.
Yeah, so I mean, it seems like there's a part where you agree, where you say the rank is useful, but it's one thing to say that Spence's model is too simple, but to say that it doesn't give us any insight at all about the uselessness of just multiplying credentials. I mean, it seems like everything you're saying is very consistent with that too. You can say, yes, it's good that we go and we get to distinction union students. Again, the main thing I would say, I don't know that Spence would say it, but that if you didn't have law school, there's lots of ways that the Supreme Court still pick people. They could pick people from the top undergraduate schools with the best GPAs.
Maybe.
They could, maybe. I mean, that is what they would do. And then the question is, how much worse would the ranking be?
One thing may be that at each level, a different type of sorting and evaluation of skills is basically going on. It may be, I don't know, right, that what is taught in constitutional law, and when basically the best student is chosen in basically constitutional law, a different student will be chosen best there than would be chosen in Calculus 1, right?
Yeah.
So it basically,
probably
but I think that basically
maybe.
Bryan and I are moving closer to agreement when I hear him use the word useful, which he does use, right? So if you use the word useful, right, then the case against education or for education has to be subtle, because you say, well, there's something useful going on there. And so then you might not want to erase a whole educational level, for example.
May I follow up by asking Miguel, what I guess an empirical question? You've pointed out that the sorting has become more thorough in the past 40, 50 years.
Yes.
So we have a more fine-grained ranking of selectivity among colleges and universities than there was in the And you also pointed out that Harvard drew from a regional or local market at the time.
Well, yeah, in the 19th
century and so on. And so my question is, is the greater thoroughness of the sorting, which you say is useful to Supreme Court justices and employers, is that because of the increase in subsidies, or is it because of technological change, which has allowed greater efficiency? I'm thinking of colleges can find and sort and match with students much more efficiently because of things like the standardized test scores, right? So you don't have to know the local schools and their idiosyncrasies. There's an imperfect and incomplete but common and objective and affordable measure for a preliminary ranking of students from all over the world.
Right.
And conversely, rankings of colleges and universities emerged in the same period so that students anywhere could rank faraway colleges. Travel becomes less expensive, airlines, so on and so forth. The society gets wealthier so that you can travel away to college more affordably and more readily. I guess what I'm asking, long-windedly, is does your explanation of the usefulness of more thorough sorting require subsidies, or is it really changing technologies that match people far away cheaply between students and colleges, rankings and SAT scores and so on, that's doing the work?
That's an excellent question. So the classic reference in this area is a 2009 paper by Caroline Hawksby. And so basically what Caroline Hawksby shows is that since the 1950s roughly, in the US, two things have happened. Some schools at the middle top, have become harder to get into. And this is basically, schools reaching out further away into the country. She also shows actually that schools at the bottom have become easier to get into. Okay, so it's not the case that every school has become more selective, but it is the case that basically when you put these two together, there is more fine-grained sorting, and it is a really nice paper. The case she presents there, I think, is more consistent with what John would call the technological story, that when she explains why it is basically that schools became more selective, she gives attributes to basically falling transportation costs and basically lower informational costs. So what used to be like a stylized fact, if you were a wealthier kid from a private school in Chicago, for example, you might go to Northwestern, a priori, right? You would just do that.
But Miguel, I've put her graph.
There it is. And nowadays, right, if you were a very talented, wealthy kid from Chicago, you're going to be looking at Stanford and so on and so forth. I don't think that she discusses this, at least that I can remember, but I think her answer would be that you do not need subsidies necessarily to do this. Subsidies, this is getting back to, basically Brian's original question. Subsidies probably facilitate this to like some extent, but probably this would have happened, in my view at least, regardless of subsidies. Subsidies are not the key issue. Why would this happen? Once again, information transmission might be part of the story.
I want to make sure the audience understands that when Professor Urquiola says information transmission, he means the same concept that Professor Caplan called signaling. So the human capital concept is that I, professor, am transmitting skills to you, student. That's not what Professor Urquiola means when he uses the phrase information transmission. That phrase in signaling means that the degree is communicating information to the employer that the student is smart, hardworking, and willing to jump through hoops, but may not know anything particularly useful for the specific job. Just so that you know that the vocabulary is on the same page.
Right, so let's see, I've got 3 different empirical questions. Right, so I was a little puzzled that you focused your model on selectivity because if you look at the empirical work on payoff for selectivity, every empirical researcher I can find says that it's overrated. This may be bad news since you're at the most expensive college in America here. But every paper I can find says that the payoff for selectivity is overrated. And at least you can explain a lot of it just by the best students, the students that would have done well go to the best schools rather than us causing it. There are even some prominent researchers who say that when you fully adjust, there doesn't seem to be much of a selectivity premium at all. So Dale and Kruger's work on this. So
Yes.
I'm a little puzzled that you would put so much emphasis on selectivity when the evidence on the rewards of selectivity are so at least so much smaller than what most parents and students seem to think.
That's a very good question. I see that John had the Hoxie paper.
Should I go back to that?
No. That's fine. Maybe some of the students have been reading that paper. That paper actually discusses that issue. The most famous reference in that literature is the paper that Brian mentioned, Dale and Kruger. And for reasons I won't go into because they're just kind of esoteric reasons, or sort of very technical reasons, Hoxie makes the point that the way in which that paper gets at this issue is pretty much, it's exactly the way you would not want to get at the issue. I read the selectivity literature as being much more mixed, and there's increasing evidence that basically it pays to go to a higher ranked school. That said, the information transmission story does not rely on, that need not be true.
It just means that it's not nearly as big a deal as people think.
The other issue that Caroline Hawksby mentions, which is true, is that going to Yale, for example, or to the richest schools, there are some rich schools, particularly clustered in the Northeast, but also California, that have lots of money for financial aid, is a very good deal because if you're smart, you can go there, signal that you're very smart, get good teachers and everything else, and on top of it, get a relatively low price. So I have a different read of the selectivity literature than you do, but it's not key to our discussion. I think we can agree or disagree.
Right. Maybe you could just switch over into your major instead, which does seem much more important. All right, so in the paper I talk about international evidence. A lot of work trying to see, if an individual gets 1 more year of education, their earnings go up by say 10%.
Mm-hmm.
If the average earnings of the workforce in the country goes up by a year, do the average earnings of the country go up by 10%? And while there is a big range, nevertheless, every paper I could find found that education pays a lot less for countries than for individuals, which seems very consistent with a simple signaling model. It seems like if your story are right, then countries might be getting a big payoff out of getting better sorting, but it doesn't seem like we see that in the data.
Yeah. So I mean, here there's a couple things. As I mentioned in my comments, I tend to agree actually a bit with what Brian calls the education enthusiasm side. That says basically everyone should go to school, right? And in fact, it is precisely because I believe that selectivity has a payoff, right? That where is a marginal student going to school? When we push a student who's not going to college, push may not be the right word, but when we get a student who would otherwise not go to college, they typically will not be going to a super fancy school, right? They're going to be going in the U.S. case to a 2-year college. In Latin America, they may be going to a private institution that works on 2 years. Lots of these students do not graduate even, right? So they don't get a credential. They don't, they just sort of wild. And there, it is pretty clear to me that that's not a good deal. If you're going to start school, and not finish even, then you're not getting the. So I actually share quite a bit of your skepticism on expansion. I do agree also with you that basically sorting, if it raises productivity, should be seen in the product of the country. But the reality is that literature that basically links years of schooling with GDP, right, which I agree shows little effect. That's very hard to establish causally, but the other thing is none of that literature measures sorting and GDP. It just measures years of schooling and GDP.
Yeah, but again, it seems like in your model, like you almost automatically get more sorting when you make education more accessible. You see, you get more, you just push up the distribution.
Not automatically. So what was true in the U.S. is that roughly from, say, independence, 1776 to 1900, there was a huge increase in the years of schooling of the American public, right? And very little selectivity. So it is true that roughly up to 1910, 1920, for example, Yale would take anyone, kind of like in the Spence model, anyone who would want to come into Yale. There wasn't like an admission test, right? But it was nowhere selective. Basically, it was open. So there was a long time period in the U.S., more than 100 years, 200 years, where the education sector expanded without selectivity. That is partially, Huxley's point. Basically, selectivity came later, starting actually, interestingly, as John points out, with a desire to, specifically exclude Jewish students in the case of Columbia. This is basically where selectivity started. And so then Columbia said, well, if we don't want to accept as many Jewish students, how can you possibly do that without saying that, right? And the answer was make admissions nebulous so that no one knows exactly what's going on. And for better and for worse, that is the system we still have in the US today. Admissions are nebulous. We don't know why people get into Columbia or into Trinity.
Yeah, so you mentioned the networking. So this is one interesting implication, which is that introverts should benefit less from college than extroverts.
Yes.
As far as I know, there's zero evidence of this.
I did not know there was evidence either way.
Yeah. Well, so personality psychologists measure the effect of personality on earnings and things like that.
So introverts should benefit more?
They should benefit less because they don't go and meet people and then they don't make the connections. But it seems like they do about as well as anybody else.
Yeah, so that, I don't know that literature.
Yeah.
Apologies.
And now I'd like to go to
An
the...
introvert.
Thank you for a lively back and forth. Now it's time to open it up to you. And we'll start with a question from Mr. Fleischman.
Talk about signaling. I had not understood when I came to a lecture on what's wrong with education, that it would be a lecture on what's wrong with vocational education. We are in a liberal arts institution, and no one has said a word about the possibility that we educate for something other than getting a job, such as how you spend your leisure time after work, and how you spend the years which Americans increasingly will spend after age 65, in which a knowledge of drama, Shakespeare perhaps, philosophy, art, music, literature, are all exceptionally valuable, and I don't think I need to say more than that about the value of a liberal education. So are we talking only about vocational education? And if so, why?
So I want to repeat the question because Mr. Fleischman doesn't have the mic. The essence of the question is, what about the other aspect of liberal arts education, since we are at Trinity College, which is it's good for the soul, and we shouldn't focus narrowly on the relationship between educational credentials and the labor market. There's your question.
All right, so I didn't want to give the whole book away for free. So I do have a full chapter on this. I take it seriously, and here's what I can say. In principle, I am totally in sympathy with the aspirations of liberal arts, and I'm someone that is personally, I guess you would say that I have at least some of the liberal arts background, but I'm a big consumer of high culture, German opera, all the stuff that most people don't like, I like. But what I do in the book is say, look, it's not enough to say this is an aspiration. We have to actually measure the extent to which it's accomplished. So here what I say is, be at least have decent data. There's very little sign that college graduates in America actually do consume noticeable amounts of high culture. Seems more like we try to make them come to like it, but we generally fail, except in a small number of cases. So in that chapter, I just try to go over all the different angles that you might for enriching people. So in general, I share the goal. I just don't see much evidence that it's really being achieved. And so in the book, I just look at like what is like general consumption of any form of high culture. It's so small that even if the education system deserved full credit for every single opera that gets consumed in America, it's just such a tiny amount that it's disappointing. So again, basically you can't you can't be judged on your aspiration. You have to be judged on how well you actually fulfill that.
There was.
Well, if Miguel wants to speak to it,
yes.
I can mention something. So I think I focus on as John has described the information transmission part, because that is what Bryan kind of says. Let's think about that, and I take that seriously myself. I personally think that there's a lot that a college that teaches liberal arts does that the labor market values. I went to Swarthmore College myself. I went to liberal arts college. I have friends in New York, for example, who work in the finance industry, and their job is to make loans, make in the classical sense. And I think that they actually do use a lot of the stuff that they learned in liberal arts colleges. For example, if they want to understand financial regulation, right? What is Senator Warren wanting? What is someone else? This is very important for a banker in New York City. They use knowledge that they learned in U.S. history, that they use in basically political science and so on and so forth. And I think, frankly, that when they're dealing with certain types of elite clients that are a big part of that industry, knowing opera, knowing this and that is used. I think that that is one reason. I'm just speculating. That is one reason employers want it. It's true that they're not using that when they're making a spreadsheet, but I think that there's value in that, and I think that's why people seek it out. Once again, I said, I'm fine with saying, let the market work it out. If people seek out, colleges like Trinity or like Swarthmore where they're learning this stuff, fine. If they want to seek out something else, that's good too.
Yeah, when taxpayers are heavily funding it, saying let the market works it out is kind of odd. I would say I am still waiting for my knowledge of opera to give me some financial rewards. I hope they come along eventually, not so far.
I'd like to give the floor to a student, Katie Said in the back.
Hi, thank you so much. I like that question a lot, and I kind of want to build off of it because I agree that and maybe that's because I'm not economics major or anything, but I think a big value of the education process is about what you learn, and even if you do forget, is it 80% of it, you likely remember the most important, like the 20% is still a lot, and it's likely the more important information. So I think like one of the values of education just in general is making you a more interested person, a more interesting person, and maybe even a happier person. And to me, that's worth $250,000.
Yeah, so there's definitely research on whether education makes people happier. The evidence is mixed, but there's actually there are actually several papers finding that all else equal, education makes you less happy, and basically by raising your expectations for how well you have to do to be considered success. So if you're a PhD who drives a taxi cab, you're probably quite unhappy, according to these papers. So it's mixed, but we're thinking about it. I don't know about any empirics on how interesting you are or interested you are. I would just say that the amount of knowledge that even college graduates have about the subject is so embarrassingly low. I don't know. It's just I wouldn't want to put anyone on the spot and say, boom, tell me everything you know about the Civil War right now. You got 5 minutes, and see if you can fill 5 minutes. But it's depressing when you really think about it.
Next question. A student in the back, and then Professor Silk.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, from your two opposing doctrines, what would you like to do or see to the education system to serve more underserved students, such as those from first-generation colleges or first-generation college families, or maybe from a bad part of Chicago or Hartford or Flint, Michigan. So from your perspective, how would you see reforms done to serve those communities?
So to both speakers, the question is, what reforms might improve access for disadvantaged students in some constructive way?
So I think that the very interesting research that has been going on is once again an information transmission thing, that it seems that there's a large number of students in places like those you've mentioned that have the wherewithal, meaning the IQ and the inclination to basically do well at a very good school, and basically identifying those people and matching them to the to the school sector is useful would be of great value, I think. One issue is that I think that there has been work going on in that. You know, there's all these experiments and things like, for example, when schools require all students to take the ACT in class, in school, this seems to have an effect because then everyone kind of knows what their score is. And I think that this type of information, intervention would be good. There's lots of people, including probably everyone in this room, that always kind of knew, you know, I'm good, or here's where I fit in the national distribution, I'm going to a good school, this and that. There's a bunch of people in the world and in poor neighborhoods who don't know that, right? They may actually be very good, but they have no idea, like, where do I fit in the national distribution? And taking a PSAT or an ACT often reveals that to a student. Say, hey, you know, I'm in the 90th percentile. It turns out that, you know, I did not know that before. So I think that's one thing I would mention.
Yeah, so that seems reasonable. And in terms of moderate reformist things, also more focus on merit scholarships. So, you know, or rather a combined merit need. So, you know, if you've got merit and you've got need, then you get the money. So focusing the money there on what would otherwise be the lost talents, that makes a lot of sense. And there are, I think, 2 states, Georgia and West Virginia, that have done this, and it seems like there's some decent payoffs. But again, I would focus on something totally outside the box, which is restoring a world where someone like that can get a good job right out of high school. There used to be such a world, right? And you may think that this is just because the economy is so technologically different. Actually, the economy is, like, the change in the technology of the economy is much less than you would think compared to 1950. You know, there are some very prominent high-tech sectors, but there's also, you know, vast swaths of the economy are barely different than they were decades ago. But you now need more education to get those jobs. So again, you know, just going back to a world where you could be a waiter at a fancy restaurant or a concierge at a nice hotel or a secretary without going to college. I think that's really the best gift that you could give people from disadvantaged backgrounds, is just to give them back the opportunities that they used to have.
Professor Silk.
Thanks to both of you for a very interesting discussion. This really gets to issues of civic education. We have pretty good empirical data indicating that the more education people have right now, the less likely they are to support President Trump. Mm-hmm. I regard that as a good thing. Some people may not. It does seem to point to an effect of higher education, and I wonder if you'd like to comment on that.
So the question from Professor Silk is the effects on civic participation and the quality of voting. Does education improve things?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I spent quite a bit of time looking into this in the book. So worth pointing out that this is historically very unusual. So the 2016 election is the first one where there was this very big gap by education. It seemed like Trump actually managed to simultaneously attract a lot of working class Democrats and alienate a bunch of well-educated Republicans. And the second group turned out to be less electorally important than the first group. Particularly, he lost votes in states where he couldn't have won anyway, and gained votes in states where he would have won. So, it doesn't seem like it's something that is generally important, but was in this case. But the bigger question is this: there actually is much better evidence that education changes people's political views, and I would say generally changes them in a direction that I consider favorable. But the question is, well, how does it work? Right? Because there's really 2 very different stories for how education works. One is that you actually come to school and you are enlightened, right? And the more people go, the more enlightened they get. The other story, though, is that it's about peer effects. That you go and you hang out with college graduates, and you pick up the views that are typical of them. Now you may say, well, what difference does it make? Well, here's the thing: if it's the peer effect story, and by the way, I think that's the main story that's true. Then when you go and cluster elites in colleges, they all influence each other in a good way. But what automatically happens is a matter of social arithmetic in the rest of society. Then they have lost the peers that would have moved them to be anti-Trump, and they sit and influence each other in a pro-Trump direction. So, and again, of course, it's not just the physical segregation of universities; it's also the social segregation they generate. So again, just suppose that you wanted to go and reduce the role of religion in society. You might say, let's go and take more people and send them to college. And you can say, for one individual, we send them to college and they hang out with a bunch of secular people, they become secular. But what have you automatically done when you move those people to college? You've made the non-college part even more religious. So if your goal was to actually change the overall society, then it's not clear that you've done anything. And again, like one way you could look at Trump is that the educated people went and voted against him. The other one you could say is that by socially isolating those people, you also remove their influence from the rest of the population. So say it's not really clear what happened.
The young man, I'm sorry I don't know your name, but you have a Trinity shirt on.
So you talked about how you want to return to being able to get a job straight out of high school. How do you
A good job. You can
yeah,
get
a good job straight out of high school. How would you go about getting that? If you turn to just vocational training, isn't it likely that student signaling would probably just spike right back up as it does in the current college?
Sorry. The question is, won't signaling happen anyway? Won't there be an arms race of credentials even without subsidies?
There's always going to be an arms race, but it can be better or worse. The one we have is really bad right now. I mean, the idea that you would need a college degree to be a waiter at a good restaurant is just so insane. And again, it would have seemed insane to almost all people throughout history. But now it's okay, well, he's a college graduate who works as a waiter. That makes sense. It does not make sense that would happen. So yes, there's always going to be a ranking. But again, just moving to a world where you can get started in life at just a younger age and without having to go and jump through these hoops, seems better in that case. And then, as I said, if we were to actually have more genuinely vocational education where you're getting trained for a job at an earlier age, that's also an alternative to what we have, and that's one where you really could actually give people, you could raise the overall quality of jobs that people have just by taking people that are bored out of their minds in school and teaching them to be plumbers or electricians, or even train them to be waiters. Right? If you be trained to be, basically do waiter school and come out and you're good at 16, and someone at Trinity, that might not seem like a big deal, but that's a good job for a lot of people.
So can I mention something quickly? I think this is a very good question. So basically getting to, what you highlight, I think, is that getting to something like Bryan proposed, this is why I use the term heavy-handed, would be very difficult because you basically have to coordinate everyone. You could tell everyone, for example, okay, folks, we're going down and everyone will get 4 years less of schooling. This is the going down one level, right? The issue will be that someone will say, well, I don't want that, right? And so the only way to get everyone to come down one step would be to force everyone to come down. That you basically highlight that would be hard to execute, and this is why I say heavy-handed. This also gets back to the vocational thing. Countries that have made the vocational thing work, Bryan mentions in his book, Europe is the key example. Germany is a key one. Do have a much more heavy-handed intervention in their educational system. Germany has basically, historically said, there's this high school sector that's owned by the government, right? And only so many people can get into it, usually the elite, the academic high school. Everyone else will go to basically vocational schools. And how will we decide that? Well, when you're 13 or something, you're going to take a test, and if you don't do well enough, you're going to go into a vocational school. Universities are also controlled by the state, and there's so many slots. In such a command and control place, you can start to do some of this stuff. I think it would be much harder in the U.S., and strikes me that the U.S. education system has many problems, but it has also lots of great attributes, I think, that come from the fact that we basically have a more liberal attitude and say, liberal meaning, anyone can do whatever they want. And so I think it would be hard to implement some of that. I think it's a good analytical exercise, but it would be hard to implement.
Yeah, so I'm not talking about forcing everyone to get one fewer degree. I'm talking about, say, cut the subsidies. So cutting subsidies isn't forcing people any more than cutting subsidies for football stadiums is forcing people to give up football. It's just saying taxpayers are not going to be pouring money on this particular industry. By the way, so your characterization of how things work in Germany is just wrong. So it's true that when you take the test and they give you a recommendation, but in the German system, you've got an absolute right to go to the academic high school if you want. If you fail out, then they will send you back. But again, it's just not nearly as rigid of a system as people in the United States think.
It has become less rigid. I agree with that.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is just how much people are willing to accept the recommendation of the teacher. So Swiss system I think is better because the Germans are actually moving in an American direction, which people say, see, that shows we're right. Or maybe the Germans are wrong about something again.
The key thing is it's a very different approach to thinking about an educational sector. The U.S. approach has been very different for better and for worse. I think it's hard for Switzerland to basically say let's be like the U.S. It's hard for the U.S. to say let's be like Switzerland. There's a whole kind of structure in in these countries that's set in a certain way, and it would be very hard to change in one or the other direction. I mean, you can on the margin do some things, and that is what Germany has done.
I mean, this is all taxpayer funded, so taxpayers spent the money on something else, you get something else.
I'm going to give the last question to a student, Jake Lord. You're in the back.
When you say it's a bit naive to say that a job in the 1950s does not match with a job in this year and in the next coming years, I mean, the most popular job in the U.S. today is truck driving. Truck driving won't be a job in the next 15 years. How can, I think when you say a more educated workforce is then needed in specialized fields to then, change over the workforce in that respect.
So the question is, doesn't technological change and a dynamic economy require a more educated workforce so that people can adapt as the labor market changes? More difficult to do is the presumption. More difficult if you're if you're on a vocational track. Does more education give the economy greater flexibility in a dynamic labor market with a lot of technological change?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one common complaint about vocational education is that what you learn may be useless after a while. One referee for my book said, why don't we train kids in typewriter repair? That sounds like a great idea. All right, and my reply to this is the critics are absolutely right. Vocational skills sometimes become obsolete. But that is no reason to train people in something that we know with near certainty will never be useful. There's the idea that in the economy it's going to become important to be an historian. There's no future in that. Poets, the kinds of subjects that people are trained for in a regular academic program, these are pipe dreams for in almost every case. Better at least to start off with training people for jobs that are realistic. Then the next best thing is to go and actually put in some forecasts and try to say, well, what jobs are likely to be important in the future? So sure, that's a reason to consider not training as many people to be truck drivers because there's a specific reason to think that it's going to be different. But again, better at least to train people for jobs where there's some demand at some point than to train them for jobs where really the only thing you can do is become a professor of that subject.
So I think there's a fair bit of information, evidence basically. This is a good question that points that workers on average are more flexible when they have education. Something changes, you say I can't drive a truck anymore. You're more able to find something else. I know that Hanishek would definitely argue that you want to basically prepare for that, and that education gives people flexibility, and that forecasting. I don't know who would be the one forecasting, saying I believe that 30 years from now we're going to need drone repair. That would have been hard to find. To think of 10 years ago. I don't know. So I think there's lots of papers that point to that, but that's not my area of work. So I'm speaking a little bit about what I don't know.
And you know what the Hanishek paper actually shows? It shows that people with vocational education have lower unemployment rates until they're in their 50s, and then they're higher. I mean, this is what I call so praising with faint damnation. It's like, what, if you go in your vocational school, then 30 years from now you might have a higher unemployment rate, although in the meanwhile you'll have a lower one.
No, but there's papers in other areas like farmers being better able to sort of see technological change and do things differently. Yeah.
Oh, Amanda, the very last question.
My question is for Mr. Caplan, and I was just wondering to what extent you might discourage your child or a family friend to not go to a liberal arts institution or an elite university because you see it as being marginally beneficial at all.
Right. So in general,
the question is, what advice would you give to someone you care about? Should they go to a liberal arts college? Should they try and aim at the most selective college they can enroll in?
Yeah, so in general, when someone asks me for personal advice, I don't tell them to do what's best for society. I try to find out their situation and help them. Maybe I should do it differently. But anyway, so what I do for my own kids, what I do for anyone is the first question is just, well, how good were you in high school? Right? Because the best predictor of success in college is success in high school. And I'd say, so if you were a good student in high school, then I'd just say that the regular conventional college route is probably going to work out well for you. On the other hand, if you were a C student or worse in high school, that's where I would say college is likely to just be a total dead end or worse. And we really need to go and think about something else that you like and are good at. In terms of what I encourage them to go to very selective schools, that's where, as I was saying, there is this separate literature on how big of a payoff is there for very elite schools. And the result that almost everyone looks at the data and says is it's not as big as it looks. right? Because again, normal people just look at the average and say Harvard students make a ton of money, so Harvard pays a lot. And like, well, wait a second, those Harvard students probably would have been done pretty well in other places too. So, for there in general, I would say that if you get a lot of financial aid, right, and not just loans. Loans aren't good. You want grants. You want discounts. That's the good stuff. That's when I would say go to a top schools for that. Would I advise someone to go and even take out subsidized student loans to go to Harvard if they could go to Berkeley or University of Virginia or something like that? And I'd say no, unless you had a very special occupation. So, like my older sons want to be professors, and I know this is an ultra snobby occupation. So, yeah, when we go to the University of Chicago, all right, and I'm training them for that. But again, they also like how good is this for society? I don't know, but I love my kids, so I tell them what's good for them, and you guys will just have to figure it out for yourselves.
I'd like to give the last word to Professor Urquiola, and then we won't have time for final statements.
So maybe I can add that last question also. I think I agree on the margin, saying that if you could go to Harvard and pay full tuition, but you have and you don't have the money, let's say, and you can get like a nice financial aid package from the university, basically, say Virginia, although usually Harvard is more generous, but I would say yes, just that it's not crucial. I do disagree with Bryan on the reading of the literature here. The papers that I would focus on basically suggest that it does pay off to go to a more selective school, and there's even evidence that it's not just that it gets you a higher earning. Everyone knows that people who graduate from Harvard say more than people make. It's that there's evidence also that it just puts you on a different earnings trajectory. Like your earnings will go up faster, and so I think that I would say all else equal, try to go to a selective school. But once again, in the right circumstances, I would also say it's definitely not the end of the world.
Yeah, but you don't think that the average earnings premium from Harvard is all caused by Harvard? Right, because remember, like normal people aren't statisticians at all, and so they just
I agree.
Yeah. So I mean so I don't even think that we disagree on this point.
No,
it's just
someone mentioned like we have two different views, or I actually think that we share lots of views, and we focus on this on this information transmission stuff. We do draw different conclusions, but I think we actually have a similar way of looking at the world.
I want to thank you both. Please, a warm round of applause for our speakers.